Commander Velthera stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the sensor displays with growing interest. The readings were unlike anything the Zephyrian defense fleet had encountered in their expansion across 47 star systems. Strange energy signatures pulsed from a small blue and green world orbiting a yellow star, in what the primitive inhabitants apparently called the Kepler 442 system. His tactical officer, Kren Voss, leaned over the control panel and made soft clicking sounds with his mandibles as he studied the data. The Zephyrian Empire had built its power through conquest and careful calculation. For 300 cycles they had swept across the galaxy, finding species after species that fell before their advanced plasma weaponry and superior technology. The pattern was always the same. Locate a primitive civilization, demonstrate overwhelming force, accept their surrender, and integrate their worlds into the Empire as tribute-paying vassals. It was efficient and profitable. This new species called humans seemed to follow the expected pattern. Their technology was laughably primitive by Zephyrian standards. They used chemical rockets to crawl between the planets in their own system. Their weapons were based on crude kinetic projectiles rather than refined energy beams. Their communication systems broadcast simple radio waves that any first-year Zephyrian cadet could intercept and decode. Everything about them suggested another easy conquest for the Empire. Admiral Korth Vess arrived on the bridge wearing the ceremonial armor that marked his rank. His scaled skin bore the ritual scars of a dozen successful campaigns against species that had dared to resist Zephyrian expansion. He moved with the confident stride of a warrior who had never known defeat in battle. The Admiral studied the tactical displays showing the human settlements scattered across their system like seeds waiting to be harvested. The humans had established mining operations in the asteroid belt between their 4th and 5th planets. Small colonies existed on their red 4th planet and several moons of the gas giants in the outer system. Their homeworld teemed with billions of the soft-skinned bipedal creatures who seemed to spend most of their time fighting among themselves rather than preparing for external threats. It was almost disappointing how vulnerable they appeared. Captain Jake Morrison of the human vessel New Horizon was the first to make contact. His ship was a pitiful thing by Zephyrian standards, barely larger than a Zephyrian scout craft and powered by primitive fusion engines that left energy trails any competent sensor operator could track from 3 systems away. The human captain began broadcasting mathematical sequences followed by what their species apparently considered music. Velthara listened to the strange harmonies and discordant sounds the humans called songs. The mathematics were basic but showed the species had at least developed beyond simple arithmetic. The music was an odd combination of rhythm and melody that served no obvious military or practical purpose. Several of his bridge crew made the chittering sounds that indicated amusement among their kind. These humans were even more primitive than initial scans had suggested. The human captain spoke in their primary language, which the Zephyrian translation computers easily decoded. Morrison talked about peace and friendship between their species. He offered to share knowledge about human culture and history. He spoke of trade agreements and mutual cooperation, as if the Zephyrians were equals, rather than the obvious superior species in this encounter. The naive optimism in his voice made several Zephyrian officers click their mandibles in what passed for laughter among their kind. Admiral Korth Vess grew tired of the humans' pointless chatter. He had conquered 12 species, and the pattern was always the same. First came the peaceful overtures and requests for dialogue. Then came the desperate pleas for mercy when the aliens realized the true nature of Zephyrian intentions. Finally came the inevitable surrender when faced with weapons and technology they could not hope to match. The sooner this human captain understood his position, the sooner the conquest could proceed according to established protocols. The Admiral ordered a demonstration of Zephyrian power. 3 human mining stations in the asteroid belt were selected as targets. The plasma cannons of the Zephyrian fleet charged with energy that could melt through meters of solid metal in seconds. The mining stations had no shields and no weapons, capable of threatening even the smallest Zephyrian patrol craft. They were populated by perhaps a few hundred humans each who probably died without even understanding what had killed them. The plasma beams struck the mining stations and turned them into expanding clouds of superheated gas and twisted metal debris. The destruction was complete and absolute within moments. Korthves watched the tactical displays with satisfaction as the human energy signatures vanished from the sensors. It was a clean demonstration of Zephyrian superiority that should convince even the most stubborn species to accept reality. The human response was not what any Zephyrian expected. Instead of immediate surrender or desperate pleas for mercy, the communications channels remained silent for several hours. When the humans finally responded, it was not Captain Morrison who spoke. A new voice identified herself as General Amy Patterson of something called Earth Defense Command. Her tone was different from the hopeful enthusiasm of the first human contact. There was steel in her voice and a coldness that reminded Velthera uncomfortably of the way Zephyrian warriors spoke before entering battle. General Patterson spoke, slowly and clearly so there could be no misunderstanding through translation errors. She said the humans had received the Zephyrian message and understood its meaning perfectly. She thanked the Zephyrians for clarifying their intentions and removing any possibility of diplomatic misunderstanding. Then she delivered the words that would haunt Velthara for the rest of his shortened life. "You have made a grave mistake," she said, and the communication channel went dead. Admiral Korthves dismissed the human response as empty bravado from a species too primitive to understand the hopelessness of their situation. He had heard similar defiant words from other species who eventually learned the futility of resisting Zephyrian might. But something in the human general's voice troubled Velthara in ways he could not explain. There had been no fear in her words, no desperation or anger. Only a cold certainty that suggested the humans knew something the Zephyrians did not. The fleet prepared for what should have been a routine conquest against another primitive species. None of them realized they were about to face an enemy unlike any the Zephyrian Empire had encountered in 3 centuries of expansion across the galaxy. 6 months passed before Fleet Admiral Zenkalar received authorization to begin the conquest of the human species. The Zephyrian High Command had spent those months analyzing every scrap of intelligence about human capabilities and reaching the obvious conclusion that this would be another routine campaign. 200 Zephyrian warships gathered at the edge of the human system, more firepower than had been needed to subdue the previous 3 species combined. The Admiral felt confident that such overwhelming force would end any human resistance within days. The human response to Zephyrian fleet movements had been predictable in some ways and puzzling in others. They had begun frantically building defensive installations around their colonies and had increased military production to levels that seemed unsustainable for their primitive economy. What puzzled Zephyrian analysts was the human tendency to convert civilian infrastructure to military purposes. Cargo ships were being fitted with weapons, mining equipment was being modified into artillery, and even passenger vessels were being transformed into crude warships. Commander Velthara now served as tactical advisor to Fleet Admiral Zenkalar. After his successful first contact with the humans, he studied the intelligence reports with growing unease as the patterns of human behavior became clear. Every previous species had responded to Zephyrian threats by building traditional military forces and fortifications. The humans were doing something different. They were turning their entire civilization into a weapon. The first battle began when Zephyrian forces encountered human patrol craft near the outer edge of their system. The human ships were pathetic by military standards, converted freighters, and mining vessels with kinetic weapons welded to their hulls. The Zephyrian plasma cannons should have destroyed them in seconds. Instead, the humans fought with a ferocity that shocked veteran Zephyrian warriors who had seen dozens of species surrender after the first exchange of fire. Captain Rick Barnes commanded a converted human cargo hauler called the Defiant Spirit. His ship had no shields, primitive armor, and weapons that could barely scratch Zephyrian hull plating. When 3 Zephyrian destroyers surrounded his vessel and demanded surrender, Barnes responded by ramming the nearest enemy ship while broadcasting what humans apparently considered battle music. The collision destroyed both vessels, but the sight of a human captain choosing certain death over surrender sent ripples of unease through the Zephyrian fleet. The pattern repeated throughout the outer system battles. Human ships fought until they were destroyed rather than surrender. Human crews would ram Zephyrian vessels if their weapons failed. Human commanders would detonate their own power cores to damage enemy ships even when defeat was certain. The Zephyrians had expected resistance, but this level of fanatical determination was unlike anything in their experience. Commander Lisa Harper defended Mars Colony with a mixed fleet of military vessels and converted civilian ships. The Red Planet had become a fortress world in the months since first contact. Its industrial capacity focused entirely on weapons production. When Zephyrian forces arrived expecting to accept the surrender of another human outpost, they found a military-industrial complex that could manufacture weapons faster than the attackers could destroy them. The Siege of Mars lasted 3 weeks, longer than Zephyrian planners had allocated for the entire human conquest. Harper used tactics that violated every convention of civilized warfare. She launched kinetic projectiles at Zephyrian ships from the planet's mass drivers. She sent unmanned vessels packed with explosives to ram enemy formations. She used the planet's communication satellites to jam Zephyrian coordination frequencies while broadcasting human propaganda to the attacking fleet. Most disturbing to Zephyrian commanders was how quickly the humans adapted to their superior technology. Captured plasma weapons were reverse-engineered within days and integrated into human defensive systems. Human engineers found ways to overload Zephyrian energy shields using their primitive kinetic rounds. Human scientists analyzed wreckage from destroyed Zephyrian ships and immediately began developing countermeasures against weapons they had never seen before. Dr. Nathan Cross was captured during the fall of Europa Station, one of the few human prisoners taken during the early battles. Most humans chose death over capture, often taking their captors with them using concealed explosives or improvised weapons. Cross was a scientist who had been working on human defense projects, and Zephyrian intelligence hoped to learn about human capabilities from interrogating him. The interrogation sessions revealed as much about human psychology as human technology. Cross showed no fear of his Zephyrian captors despite being completely at their mercy. He answered some questions about human scientific capabilities while refusing to provide information that might harm human resistance. When asked why his species fought so desperately against obviously superior forces, Cross explained something that chilled his interrogators. Humans had been fighting wars among themselves for thousands of years before meeting the Zephyrians. They had developed weapons capable of destroying their entire planet, and had somehow avoided using them through a combination of deterrence and diplomacy. They had survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, plagues, and wars that killed millions while still advancing their civilization. The Zephyrians represented just another threat to overcome, rather than an insurmountable obstacle. Cross told his captors about human history in simple terms they could understand. Humans had faced extinction dozens of times throughout their evolution and had always found ways to survive. They had developed technologies to live in environments that would kill most species. They had created weapons that could crack continents, and had learned to control those weapons rather than be controlled by them. The Zephyrian attack had simply activated survival instincts that had been refined across millions of years. The human scientist explained that Zephyrians had made a fundamental error in their understanding of human nature. They assumed humans would behave like the other species the Empire had conquered, fighting with honor according to established rules of warfare. Humans had no such limitations. They would use any tactic, any weapon, and any strategy that might lead to victory regardless of cost or consequences. Cross delivered his final assessment in words that would be repeated throughout the Zephyrian fleet within days. "You don't understand what you've awakened," he said. The Zephyrians had attacked a species that had been preparing for war since before they developed spaceflight. Every human conflict had taught them lessons about combat, strategy, and survival that they could now apply against an external enemy. Fleet Admiral Zen Kalar found himself facing something unprecedented in Zephyrian military history. The humans were not just resisting conquest. They were learning from every engagement and becoming more effective with each battle. Human tactics evolved daily as they analyzed Zephyrian methods and developed countermeasures. Human technology advanced in weeks rather than years as their entire civilization focused on the single goal of survival. The Admiral began to understand that this would not be the quick conquest the High Command had expected. The humans were not going to surrender after losing their military forces because every human seemed to be a potential warrior. They were not going to accept defeat after losing their colonies because they treated every loss as motivation for revenge, rather than a reason to quit. The Zephyrian Empire was facing an enemy that might actually be more dangerous than they had initially appeared. 2 years of warfare had transformed the conflict from an expected quick conquest into something resembling a nightmare for the Zephyrian Empire. What should have been a simple demonstration of superior firepower had become a grinding campaign across multiple star systems as human forces spread the fighting far beyond their home system. The Zephyrians controlled more territory and possessed better technology, but they were beginning to realize that neither advantage guaranteed victory against an enemy that refused to accept defeat. Captain Ben Rodriguez commanded the human fleet, designated Task Force Vengeance, a name that perfectly captured the change in human strategy since the war began. The early desperate defense of their colonies had evolved into aggressive strikes against Zephyrian positions throughout the contested region. Rodriguez flew a ship that would have been impossible 2 years earlier, a hybrid design that combined captured Zephyrian plasma technology with human engineering innovations to create weapons the Zephyrians had never imagined. The human fleet, under Rodriguez, moved through space using tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare, as understood by Zephyrian military doctrine. They attacked supply lines rather than engaging in honorable fleet battles. They targeted civilian installations that supported Zephyrian military operations. They used captured Zephyrian ships crewed by human volunteers on suicide missions designed to maximize enemy casualties rather than territorial gains. War leader Thex Morna watched the tactical displays from his command ship as Rodriguez's fleet approached the Zephyrian mining colony of Keth Prime. The human force was outnumbered 3-1 by the Zephyrian defenders and should have been destroyed in direct combat. Instead of attacking the heavily fortified military installations, the humans had strapped nuclear warheads to asteroids and hurled them at the colony's population centers from beyond the range of planetary defenses. The tactic was brutally effective and completely without honor by Zephyrian standards. The asteroid bombardment killed millions of Zephyrian civilians and rendered 3 continents uninhabitable. The military installations remained intact, but the colony could no longer support them. The defending fleet was forced to withdraw to protect other targets, giving the humans control of the system without the traditional fleet engagement that Zephyrian doctrine demanded. Human innovation in warfare seemed to accelerate with each month of conflict. They created swarms of small unmanned fighters that attacked in coordinated patterns impossible for organic pilots to execute. Individual human ships carried hundreds of these drone weapons that could overwhelm the defenses of much larger Zephyrian vessels through sheer numbers. The drones were cheap to produce and required no trained pilots, allowing humans to replace losses faster than Zephyrians could inflict them. Admiral Kate Sullivan led the human First Fleet in an assault on the Zephyrian fortress world of Vex-Terran that demonstrated how far human military thinking had evolved since the war began. Traditional military doctrine would have required a direct assault against the heavily defended planet, resulting in massive casualties for the attacking force. Sullivan instead turned the Zephyrian communication network against itself. Human computer specialists had spent months analyzing captured Zephyrian technology and had learned to infiltrate their quantum communication systems. Sullivan's fleet transmitted viruses and logic bombs through the Zephyrian network that caused their own defensive systems to malfunction at critical moments. Automated defense platforms turned their weapons against each other, while communication jammers prevented Zephyrian commanders from coordinating their response to the human attack. The fall of Vex-Terran sent shockwaves through the Zephyrian Empire that went far beyond military considerations. 3 tributary species that had been conquered by the Zephyrians decades earlier saw the human victory as proof that the Empire could be defeated. The Althari rebellion began within days of news reaching their homeworld, followed by uprisings among the Keth and Vorin populations who had been living under Zephyrian occupation. War leader Thex Morna found himself fighting a war on multiple fronts, as species the Zephyrians had considered permanently subjugated began demanding independence. The human example had shown that resistance was possible even against seemingly overwhelming odds. Worse, the rebel species were adopting human tactics and strategies, turning the Zephyrian Empire's own infrastructure against itself in ways that traditional military forces could not counter. The humans had somehow inspired rebellion among species that had accepted Zephyrian rule for generations. They accomplished this not through diplomacy or propaganda, but by demonstrating that victory was possible through determination and innovation. The sight of primitive humans defeating advanced Zephyrian forces convinced other species that they, too, might throw off the chains of imperial domination. Commander Vel Thara studied intelligence reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of Zephyrian prospects in the war. Human forces had learned to manufacture weapons and equipment using captured Zephyrian technology combined with their own innovations. They could now produce plasma cannons more powerful than anything in the Zephyrian arsenal. They had developed armor that could withstand directed energy weapons that had been unstoppable for centuries. Most disturbing was the human ability to adapt their entire civilization to support the war effort. Zephyrian society was built around a military elite, supported by conquered populations who provided tribute and labor. Human society seemed capable of transforming every citizen into a potential warrior or weapons manufacturer. Children learned military tactics alongside mathematics, while elderly humans designed weapon systems that challenged Zephyrian engineers. With decades of experience, the humans had also mastered psychological warfare in ways that left Zephyrian commanders struggling to maintain morale among their own forces. Human broadcasts reached Zephyrian troops throughout the Empire, telling them about the futility of fighting for a system that viewed them as expendable. The messages included testimonies from liberated populations describing Zephyrian brutality and the hope for freedom that human victories represented. War leader Thex Morna received reports that human special forces had infiltrated several Zephyrian worlds and were conducting sabotage operations behind enemy lines. These humans moved through Zephyrian territory like ghosts, striking at targets that had been considered completely secure. They destroyed supply depots, assassinated military commanders, and recruited local populations to join resistance movements that spread faster than Zephyrian forces could contain them. The pattern of human warfare had become clear to anyone willing to see it. They did not fight for territory or resources in the traditional sense. They fought to destroy the Zephyrian Empire's ability to wage war by targeting every aspect of imperial infrastructure. Human strategy aimed at making Zephyrian occupation so costly and dangerous that the Empire would collapse under the weight of maintaining control over rebellious populations. Thex Morna began to understand what Dr. Nathan Cross had meant when he warned that the Zephyrians had awakened something they did not understand. Humans were not just another species to be conquered and integrated into the Empire. They were a force of change that would remake the galaxy according to their own vision of how civilizations should interact. The war was no longer about Zephyrian expansion, but about the survival of everything the Empire represented. 4 years of war had brought the impossible within sight of reality, as human fleets approached the core systems of the Zephyrian Empire. The species that had begun the conflict, with primitive chemical rockets and kinetic weapons, now commanded technology superior to anything the Zephyrians possessed. The Empire that had ruled 47 star systems for 3 centuries faced the prospect of total defeat at the hands of creatures they had dismissed as barely civilized animals. Commander Rick Hayes led the human assault fleet designated Operation Homecoming toward Zephyr Prime, the capital world that had never known invasion in over 1,000 years of Zephyrian civilization. His ships were marvels of engineering that combined the best Zephyrian technology with human innovations to create vessels capable of feats that neither species could have achieved alone. The irony was not lost on Hayes that humanity's greatest weapons were built from the knowledge of their enemies. The human fleet moved through space with the confidence of a species that had learned to turn every disadvantage into a strategic advantage. They had developed faster-than-light communication systems that allowed real-time coordination across vast distances. They had created weapons that could penetrate any known defense and defenses that could absorb punishment from entire enemy fleets. Most importantly, they had mastered the art of fighting a war across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Emperor Neth Volaris stood in his throne room overlooking the capital city of his empire and tried to comprehend how the situation had deteriorated so completely. 4 years earlier, His military advisors had assured him that the human conquest would be completed within months. Now those same advisors spoke of negotiating surrender terms, before the humans decided that mercy was no longer an option for the Zephyrian leadership. The humans had demonstrated capabilities that challenged every assumption about how civilizations developed and waged war. They created weapons specifically designed to exploit Zephyrian biology, targeting the neural pathways that controlled Zephyrian motor functions. They employed biological warfare agents that were harmless to humans, but devastatingly effective against Zephyrian physiology. They had weaponized their own understanding of xenobiology in ways that violated every treaty governing civilized conflict. Admiral Shextaran commanded the final defense of the Zephyrian core worlds with forces that represented the last reserves of imperial military power. His fleets included veteran units that had conquered dozens of worlds for the Empire. But even these experienced warriors showed signs of the demoralization that had spread throughout Zephyrian society. They were fighting an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each defeat, while the Empire grew weaker with each victory. The psychological impact of human tactics had proven as devastating as their military innovations. Humans broadcast continuous propaganda throughout Zephyrian space, detailing the crimes committed by Imperial forces against conquered populations. They displayed evidence of mass executions, forced labor programs, and cultural genocide that the Empire had perpetrated across generations of expansion. The broadcast reached Zephyrian civilians, who had been told their military served a noble cause of bringing civilization to primitive worlds. Colonel Mary Thompson led the human ground forces preparing for planetary assault operations against the Zephyrian homeworld. Her troops were volunteers who had lost family members in the initial Zephyrian attacks and viewed the coming battle as an opportunity for justice rather than conquest. The distinction was important because it meant humans would fight with the desperation of the wronged rather than the calculation of invaders seeking territory. Human intelligence services had spent years infiltrating Zephyrian society and building networks of contacts among the conquered species within the Empire. When human forces approached Zephyr Prime, they were supported by resistance movements that had been planning for this moment throughout the war. The Zephyrian capital found itself facing attack from within, as well as from the approaching human fleet. The siege of Zephyr Prime began with human forces demonstrating their mastery of orbital warfare. They deployed weapons platforms at the edge of the system that could strike targets on the planet's surface with precision that made traditional planetary defenses obsolete. Zephyrian military installations were destroyed from distances that made retaliation impossible, while civilian areas remained untouched to minimize casualties among non-combatant populations. Emperor Nethvalaris received reports that painted a picture of systematic destruction of imperial military capabilities, combined with careful protection of civilian infrastructure. The humans were not interested in ruling over ruins or governing a population that hated them. They wanted to dismantle the military machine that had enabled Zephyrian expansion, while preserving the people and culture that had existed before the Empire's rise to power. The Emperor's military advisors presented him with strategic analyses that all reached the same conclusion. Continued resistance would result in the complete destruction of Zephyrian civilization, while surrender might allow their species to survive in some form. The humans had demonstrated throughout the war that they preferred to rehabilitate conquered enemies rather than exterminate them, but only when those enemies abandoned aggressive expansion and accepted limits on their military capabilities. Admiral Shextaran made the decision to open communications with the human fleet commander rather than wait for imperial authorization. His duty was to preserve what remained of Zephyrian military honor while minimizing further casualties among his personnel. The humans had earned respect through their conduct of the war and deserved to be treated as equals rather than barbarians despite their primitive origins. The communication exchange between Shex Torin and Commander Hayes revealed how completely the balance of power had shifted during 4 years of warfare. The human commander spoke with the confidence of absolute victory, while offering terms that were generous considering the circumstances. Zephyrian military forces would be disbanded and their weapons destroyed, but the civilian population would be allowed to rebuild their society along lines that did not threaten other species. Colonel Thompson's ground forces encountered scattered resistance as they advanced through the Zephyrian capital, but found most of the population eager to end a war that had cost them everything. The Imperial military had conscripted increasing numbers of civilians as the conflict continued, draining Zephyrian society of the people needed to maintain their civilization. The humans represented an end to the destructive cycle that threatened to consume what remained of Zephyrian culture. Emperor Neth Valeris faced the final decision of his reign as human forces surrounded the Imperial palace. He could order a final battle that would result in the destruction of the capital city and the death of millions of civilians, or he could surrender and trust human promises of fair treatment for the Zephyrian people. The choice represented everything the war had been about. The difference between a civilization that valued honor above life and one that valued life above honor. The Emperor's final act was to broadcast a message throughout what remained of the Zephyrian Empire, announcing the end of imperial expansion and the beginning of a new era of cooperation with other species. His words carried the authority of someone who had learned too late that true strength came from building rather than destroying, from protecting rather than conquering. The broadcast marked the end of the Zephyrian Empire and the beginning of humanity's emergence as the dominant military power in their region of the galaxy. War chronicler Yeth Karna activated the final recording device in the last Zephyrian command post as human forces closed in on their position deep beneath the ruins of the Imperial Palace. The chronicler had served the Empire for 60 years, documenting victories across dozens of worlds and recording the testimonies of conquered species who learned to accept Zephyrian rule. Now the roles were reversed and it fell to Yeth Karna to record the final words of a civilization that had ruled the galaxy for 3 centuries before encountering humanity. The recording would serve multiple purposes for whatever species might discover it in the future. It was confession and warning, historical document and strategic analysis of how the mighty Zephyrian Empire had been brought to ruin by creatures they had dismissed as primitive animals. Most importantly, it was a testament to the fundamental error in understanding that had doomed his people from the moment they decided to attack the human colonies. General Chris Morgan led the final human assault through the underground bunkers where the last Zephyrian commanders had taken refuge. His forces moved with the professional competence of soldiers who had spent 4 years perfecting the art of war against a technologically superior enemy. They used weapons that combined Zephyrian energy technology with human tactical innovations to create tools of destruction that neither species could have developed independently. The humans offered the surviving Zephyrians the same choice they had extended throughout their conquest of the Empire: surrender and accept exile to a remote world where they could rebuild their society without threatening other species, or die fighting for an empire that no longer existed. It was a choice the Zephyrians had never offered their own victims during 3 centuries of expansion across the galaxy. Yeth Karna spoke into the recording device as explosions echoed through the bunker complex above. The chronicler's words were measured and precise, chosen to convey the full scope of Zephyrian failure. To any species that might face humanity in the future, the Empire had made every possible mistake in their evaluation of human capabilities and intentions, leading to consequences that would reshape the balance of power throughout their region of space. The Zephyrians had assumed humans would fight, according to the same rules that governed conflict between civilized species. They expected formal battles between military forces, negotiated truces when casualties became too high, and eventual surrender when defeat became inevitable. Instead, humans fought with the desperation of a species that viewed extinction as the only alternative to victory. Every human seemed willing to die before accepting subjugation. War chronicler Yeth Karna had studied the reports from every major engagement of the war and identified the pattern of human tactical evolution that had doomed the Zephyrian Empire. Humans learned from every defeat and adapted their strategies faster than Zephyrian commanders could develop countermeasures. They treated each battle as a laboratory experiment that provided data for improving their performance in the next engagement. The humans had demonstrated an understanding of warfare that went beyond mere tactics and technology to encompass the psychological and economic dimensions of conflict. They attacked Zephyrian morale by broadcasting evidence of imperial crimes to conquered populations throughout the empire. They targeted supply lines and industrial infrastructure rather than just military forces. They inspired rebellion among tributary species by proving that the Empire could be defeated. Emperor Neth Valaris had chosen death over exile when General Morgan offered him the opportunity to live as a private citizen on a world far from the centers of galactic power. The Emperor's final words expressed regret for the suffering his empire had caused, but maintained that Zephyrian expansion had brought civilization to primitive worlds that would otherwise have remained barbaric. He died believing his people had served a noble purpose, even as evidence mounted that their civilization had been built on the suffering of others. Most surviving Zephyrian military commanders chose exile over death when faced with the final human assault. Admiral Shextaran led thousands of former Imperial personnel to the transport ships that would carry them to their new home, on a world at the edge of known space. They would live under human supervision for a generation, while learning to build a society based on cooperation rather than conquest. The human treatment of defeated Zephyrian forces revealed something about their species that disturbed Yethkarna more than their military capabilities. Humans seemed genuinely committed to justice rather than revenge, despite the enormous casualties they had suffered during 4 years of warfare. They prosecuted Zephyrian leaders who had committed war crimes while protecting civilians and lower-ranking military personnel who had simply followed orders. War chronicler Yethkarna understood that humanity represented something unprecedented in galactic history. They possessed the military capability to conquer other species, but seemed more interested in liberating populations from oppressive governments. They had the technology to rule an interstellar empire, but appeared committed to allowing other species to govern themselves according to their own values and traditions. The chronicler's analysis of human behavior throughout the war revealed a species that fought not for territory or resources, but for abstract principles that they called freedom and justice. Humans seemed willing to sacrifice their own lives to protect the rights of species they had never met before encountering the Zephyrian Empire. They treated warfare as a necessary evil rather than a glorious endeavor, and sought to end conflicts as quickly as possible rather than prolong them for strategic advantage. General Morgan entered the final chamber where Yethkarna waited with the recording device still running. The human commander showed no satisfaction in his victory over the empire that had started the war by destroying defenseless mining stations. He offered the chronicler the same choice given to other Zephyrian survivors: exile to a world where the remnants of their civilization could rebuild without threatening other species, or death in defense of ideals that no longer had meaning. War chronicler Yethkarna chose to remain and face death rather than abandon the duty to record the final moments of Zephyrian civilization. The chronicler's last words were intended as both epitaph and warning for any species that might discover the recording in the future. They contained the wisdom gained through 4 years of warfare against an enemy that had seemed inferior in every measurable way, except for the qualities that mattered most in the crucible of total war. The recording captured Yethkarna's final assessment of the human species and the lessons learned from Zephyrian defeat. Humans were not predators seeking prey or conquerors building empires. They were something far more dangerous to species that relied on oppression and exploitation to maintain their power. Humans were justice incarnate, wrapped in flesh and fury, with the capability and determination to remake the galaxy according to their vision of how civilizations should treat each other. The war chronicler's voice remained steady as human soldiers breached the final chamber. The last words of Zephyrian civilization were a warning to any species that might encounter humanity in the future. Never make them your enemy, because they do not fight to win battles or capture territory. They fight to ensure that no being lives in chains, and they will sacrifice everything to achieve that goal. The recording ended as Yethkarna's voice faded to static, and the Zephyrian Empire passed into history.